Today's edition of Broadcast is brought to you by SituationHub.com. Crisis communications better and faster. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. Schedule a demo today. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Broadcast, where we give you bite-sized bits of best practices to help you be a better leader and a more effective communicator. I am your host, Gerard Braud. As always on YouTube, if you want more content from this channel, hit the subscribe button so you'll get a notice when new content appears. And if you want your friends to know, hey, probably ought to watch this video, give it the old thumbs up. Recently, I was teaching a master class for SituationHub.com, and I thought it would be interesting to look at two different historic events and compare them. So being from New Orleans, I picked Hurricane Katrina as one event. And considering that we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, I decided to look at that event. So let's look at a comparison, Hurricane Katrina versus COVID-19. And the only thing that I'm going to ask you as we do this comparison is, whether you know me or not, what you need to know about me is I look through a single lens at life. I look at the crisis. Can the crisis be stopped? Can the crisis be eliminated? And if the crisis can't be stopped and eliminated, how much can we do through the sake of communication to make life better for people around us? So in both of these situations, you need to recognize that nothing I'm telling you is related to anyone's politics or political beliefs. But the first thing we have to recognize about COVID-19 is we have never been in a crisis before where there are essentially two belief systems about the crisis. There is the science side and those who deny or ignore the science. There are mask wearers and those who refuse to wear a mask. There are those who are willing to social distance and those who want to charge in and breathe on someone. It is a very divided nation, and it is very bizarre. You never see a hurricane where people argue over whether or not you should evacuate. You never see a forest fire where people argue and debate whether or not moving out of the way of the flames is the right thing to do. So we live in very odd, very strange times. That in both Hurricane Katrina, which is 15 years ago, August 29th, and COVID-19, there was a failure to plan, there was a failure to follow plans, there was a failure to manage expectations, and a failure of all of these things led to a compounded crisis, which means the first crisis led to the second crisis, led to the third crisis, and so on. And the crisis not only affects the core area, but it affects everyone adjacent to the core area. So in the case of Hurricane Katrina, I predicted Hurricane Katrina 15 years before it happened. So that was 30 years ago. If you want to see what I look like with a full head of hair as a young reporter, you can go and Google a video called When the Big One Hits with my name, Gerard, G-E-R-A-R-D, Braud. And I predict what's going to happen in Hurricane Katrina 15 years before it happens. And I did it with the help of the National Weather Service, who told me New Orleans was their worst case scenario. Other communities began preparing when that report aired. And over 15 years, they put systems in place and plans in place that were both emergency operations plans, disaster recovery plans, crisis communications plans, and a variety of other plans. And when word came of how catastrophic the storm was going to be, the communities around New Orleans began putting their emergency plans in place, with activities happening at 72 hours, 64 hours, 48 hours, 36 hours, 24 hours, 12 hours. Like clockwork, evacuations were taking place, people were leaving town. Not Orleans Parish, not New Orleans proper. Two things come into play as we talk about the mayor and Katrina, and we talk about COVID-19. The personality behavior of the leader is critical. People listen to a leader. If a leader tells you don't do something, people tend not to do it. If the leader tells you to do something, they can be persuaded to do it. The second thing to know is that a leadership characteristic that leads to failure is when a person is in denial of how bad something could get. And the third factor is you combine the denial with what they say or not say, and a personality type that gets flawed because they look at one impact that could be huge and negative without realizing the cascading effect. So in the case of New Orleans, the mayor didn't put plans in place, or there were some plans, but he ignored them, ignored the advice of his experts, and decided to wing it. And he was also burdened because he was told by his legal team, you know, if you call an evacuation, you're responsible for moving all of the poor, the indigent, the ill, people in hospitals, and all the tourists. You're responsible for them to move them out of town. It's a liability issue. And that's when he choked. Additionally, that could have been predicted. It was predictable, and it could have been planned for, and systems could have been put in place. But it wasn't done in advance. Proper planning did not take place. So therefore, there was flawed execution and the flaw of the burden of the finance and the moving of the indigent and the ill and the evacuations that would have happened. When NBC News came on the air and read a statement from the National Weather Service that winds would be so strong that it would tear the skin off of people, and that anyone who was outside would die, and even livestock would die, and that the city would flood and every business would be shut and damage would be catastrophic. It was 12 hours before the storm when the mayor attempted an evacuation, but it was too late. Essentially, he had a cavalier attitude, and his communications was lackadaisical. So people essentially thought, well, if the mayor's not concerned, why should I be concerned? And you saw the pictures when the city of New Orleans flooded and more than 2,000 people died. So that was the first crisis. But then the second crisis is you now have nearly 1 million people stuck on rooftops with no water, no food, in August and September heat, and they all need to be rescued, either by boat or by helicopter. That's a multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar process that did not have to happen if those people had been moved out of harm's way by simply communicating the evacuation ahead of time. So that was the compounding effect. But then there was the other compounding effect that after they were rescued, there was no place to put them. And then they had to gear up a post-storm relocation program that also cost billions of dollars. So that's a glimpse at how one crisis that could have been eliminated or dealt with or communicated about, how managed expectations could have manipulated the behavior of people. But people didn't respond because the communications wasn't firm. Now, with that same lens, look at COVID-19, a failure to manage expectations of the severity, the downplaying of how horrific this could be. Certain people in leadership were in denial about how bad it could be. Other people in leadership, like the mayor of New Orleans did, were worried about, well, what's the biggest effect? In this case, it was the effect of the election, and an election hinging upon a successful economy and the fear that the economy would tank. Now, every crisis communications plan that has come off of one of my computers since 1996 has a pandemic element to it. So this is going back to 1996. Regular pandemics, pandemics unnamed, SARS, H1N1, Ebola, we've done them all. It's part of the plan, it's part of the communication strategy. And not only is the plan built to handle it, but so are pre-written statements. The failure in this case to manage the expectations and the political divide has led people to not be in unison for combating and terminating this crisis. This crisis should have been contained in a large way within 90 days. Early on, I was interviewed about this, and I said, if everybody does what they're supposed to do, and this was done early in March when I started talking about this. The first time I started blogging about it was in February, but my prediction was 90 days if we all do it right. If we drag our feet, it'll be 120 days, at worst 160 days. Well, we're far past that now, and the crisis continues. So at this point in time, October 1st, 2020, we're now in excess of 200,000 people dying. I think that's unacceptable to let people die when something as simple as a mask, social distancing, and washing your hands has the ability to drastically mitigate the impact. But if everybody's not going to do it, then the crisis gets stretched out. Then there is the compounding effect. On this day today, airlines have announced massive layoffs. Tens of thousands of people from the airlines were terminated today because of the downturn in the economy. So the economy continues to struggle, unemployment continues to be an issue, and then there are the other issues such as remote learning and all the things that parents have to deal with. But this compounded crisis also affects you at a rural electric cooperative, right? Because it was announced that you could not turn off or disconnect anyone's electrical meter, which means if they don't pay, you don't have revenue to operate and you go into the negative. And that also means you don't have money to pay your transmission company, your G&T. And that means they don't have money to pay fuel. So when we go back to that definition of a crisis being something that affects revenue, reputation, and brand, it's the perfect storm. But it all, in my opinion, by using the tools that we know are tried and true in crisis communications, could have mitigated this crisis as well as mitigating other crises. So, definitely some similarities. Are you prepared for your next crisis? Will your next crisis damage your revenue, reputation, and brand? Will you perform flawlessly, or will you make some of the mistakes that we saw in these examples? If you need help with your crisis communication strategy, a vulnerability assessment, or getting a library of pre-written news releases for your crisis communications plan, by all means, use the link that you see on the screen, and let's schedule a confidential 15-minute call. For the broadcast, I'm Gerard Braud.